Well, this evening, I'm very honored, myself and all of you, having one of the most distinguished Catholics in the United States, and perhaps the outstanding Catholic layman. George Weigel is the Distinguished Senior Fellow of Washington Ethics and Public Policy Center, but he is a very well-known author and speaker on behalf of the Catholic community. And he has written extensively, particularly Pope John Paul II, his book, Witness to Hope, biography of Pope John Paul II, been translated into a dozen languages. And his next book, a beautiful book, The End and the Beginning, Pope John Paul II, The Victory of Freedom, the last years of his legacy. It's an outstanding book, and I've been reading it lately, and I've been very impressed, not only of Pope John Paul, but also of George Weigel's presentation. So, George, welcome this evening.
Thank you, Father Benedict. It's great to be here with you.
And as you know, we have a very large listening audience. And next week, our speaker is Ann Halpin from the World Youth Alliance. She'll be there with us. And I want to also remind you that we're having which you can get from us, our Franciscan University pilgrimage, April 28th to May 3rd in Washington, Philadelphia, and New York. You'll see it right there on the screen. So, but we're tonight, John Paul II. What a marvelous ability we have tonight to go back over the memory of this outstanding person who covered the lives of many of us for so many years. He was the Pope,
right?
The Pope. Now our dear, wonderful, present Holy Father follows along from his line. But in your book, The End and the Beginning, you particularly talk about the Pope being, when he was a cardinal and a Pope, confronting bad things. And he started out where? Right?
In Poland. And perhaps it might be of some interest to our viewers tonight, as well as to our audience here, for me to say a word about how this book happened. The last time I saw John Paul II was at dinner just before Christmas in 2004. Witness to Hope had been out for 5 years at that point. It covered his life and his pontificate up through 1998. But I said to him in the course of that evening, Holy Father, if you don't bury me, I want to tell you that I will finish what I began. And this new book, The End and the Beginning, is the fulfillment of that promise to him. I take the story up to the end of his life. I try to assess the man and his achievement. But as you just indicated, Father, the book has a first third that I rather didn't expect to write in 2004. But 3 years ago, I came into possession of some remarkable materials from the formerly top-secret files of communist secret police agencies all over Central and Eastern Europe. And those materials, which paint a dramatic portrait of the communist war against the Catholic Church from the Second World War until 1989, have allowed me to revisit that facet of John Paul II's life in much more dramatic detail than even I was able to do in Witness to Hope.
Well, it's dramatic, absolutely. The KGB, some of these guys are now retired and back home, and I wonder what they're thinking about all of this.
Well, perhaps they're reading this with some sense of chagrin, I hope.
But no, and I think many Catholics did not realize how the Pope, Karol Wojtyła, confronted the what they call the satanic enterprise, he really went and faced it.
When I was first beginning to work on Witness to Hope in 1996, I remember a dinner at Castel Gandolfo at the papal summer residence when it was simply the Pope and his secretary, then Monsignor Dziwisz, now the Cardinal Archbishop of Krakow, and myself. And the conversation turned to this struggle against the communist regimes of Central and Eastern Europe. And Monsignor Dziwisz said to me that evening, you have to understand that it was always us and them. This was all war all the time. This was not a matter of episodic confrontations with long periods of calm in between. It was all war all the time. This was not like a parliamentary party and its opposition. It was all war all the time. Now, over 30 years of confronting this, Karol Wojtyła, as priest, as bishop, as Archbishop of Krakow, as Cardinal Archbishop, deployed a whole variety of instruments of resistance, of which the most powerful was his ability to speak the truth. This was not a man, as I came to know him over almost 20 years, this was not a man naturally given to raising his voice. This was a man of reason, he was a man of compassion, he was a genuine pastor. He didn't like to pound the table. But he learned how to do that. He learned how to be a tremendous public personality in Poland by advocating for the human rights of all of his people, not just his Catholic people, not just the church, but the fundamental human rights of all. And he became the public personality that the world discovered after he became Pope in 1978, precisely through that confrontation with communism. So in an odd way, this 30-year struggle in Poland prepared him in a unique way to be the Pope who could rivet the world's attention for more than a quarter of a century. God works in very strange ways here.
Now, when he was elected, communism was still in charge. And he went back to visit Poland after he was Pope. And I remember reading the articles or hearing on television. I said, good heavens, isn't this dangerous going back there?
Those 9 days in June 1979, June 2nd to 10th, are ever more clearly one of the hinges on which modern history turned. We talk about September 1st, 1939, and the beginning of the Second World War in Europe. Americans talk about December 7th, 1941. More recently, 9/11, etc. June 2nd to 10, 1979, was a period in which the history of the world turned in a fundamental way. Those 9 days were days in which the Pope, without discussing politics, without banging on the government overtly, restored to his people the truth about themselves. He said in his homilies, in his major public addresses, in his meetings with different pastoral groups, you're not who they say you are. Let me remind you who you really are. And in giving back to his people the truth about themselves, he gave them new forms of political resistance that communism simply could not match. He ignited, as I put it in this book and in its predecessor, Witness to Hope, a revolution of conscience. And that revolution of conscience produced a new kind of politics, which finally took form 13 months later in the Solidarity movement. And the rest, as we say, is history.
Solidarity came right out of there.
Exactly.
And it was his word, isn't it?
And it was his word. I mean, it was a word he had used in his philosophical work, but it was also a word that, for John Paul II, captured in a unique way what human beings are capable of when they work together. When they work together for a common cause, for a great good, great things can happen. He was not a Pelagian. He knew that the grace of God was absolutely fundamental to all of this. But neither was he the kind of realist, quote unquote, who says, look, it's a mess, but you got to take the mess for what it is. There's not much you can do about this. He was never prepared to say, we can't change a bad situation.
Now, here's a very interesting question. And maybe it's not a fair question. He went there to Poland. Obviously, the communists were unhappy that he was coming.
Right.
And he was there for 9-10 days. Did he ever change any of them? Or in the course of the months and years ahead, did some of them lost some of their zeal for atheistic communism?
I think he changed several things. He obviously gave new heart and hope to his own Catholic people. And he gave them a public vocabulary that allowed them to build bridges to non-Catholic or non-believing human rights activists, etc. He surely began a process of self-examination in the minds of less hardened communist officials. Although, as I show in the end of the beginning, they continued the war against him up till the very end. I think perhaps the most important change he created was in young people who were tending to grow up cynical. I remember a friend of mine who later became a priest in Poland said that the effect on him of those 9 days was that he decided, I don't want to live a lie the rest of my life. We may never win this, but at least I don't have to live the lie during the struggle. And I suspect that his experience was multiplied through many, many
It would seem to me that all of these people, many of whom were not intellectuals or not aware of all the historical things involved, even political things, the thing that they all did, they went to church. They went to church, big time. And the place was absolutely crowded with church. The old saying, go to church. And that's what they did.
No, it's still the case today. I mean, Poland is perhaps the most intensely Catholic country on the planet. And I remember your friend and mine, the late Father Richard Newhouse, saying to me in Krakow, in the city of John Paul II, once, about 10 years ago, on a Sunday, he said, it's remarkable to be in a city where the principal civic activity appears to be going to church.
Oh, yeah.
But it was in that going to church that these people got that truth about themselves, that they could then deploy when John Paul II gave him the tools to do that. Stalin, not normally known for his sense of humor, famously said that trying to make Poland a communist country was like trying to fit a saddle on a cow. And the reason that was so difficult was precisely because of this intense identification between Catholicism and Polish self-understanding.
And that was Stalin who said that?
Stalin said that, yeah.
I never thought he made an intelligent remark. Now
His one contribution to the Oxford Dictionary of Humor here.
After all that, maybe he's going to be the last man out of purgatory. Who knows? Well, George, I'm very grateful, and I'm sure our audience is fascinating. Now we're going to move on after our break, and we'll be looking further into the personality of this man. Such a fascinating person, and came from a little Polish town, and he was not a prince. He had not had a great education behind him. He went the long way. So we'll be back in 2 minutes and start getting some questions together. George, I'm anxious, and I think some of our audience, about the person. What this remarkable person is. When he came here to Dunwoody, I had the opportunity to be alone in the chapel when all of a sudden he came out of behind the altar. I was there all by myself. I almost fainted right on the spot. And gently, prayerfully, quiet person.
I've been thinking about this life intensely for 15 years, and what I have concluded is that at the bottom of all of this, the accomplishment, the remarkable range of human gifts that he had, the fantastic energy. I mean, this man was, even when ill, was maintaining a remarkable pace. At the bottom of all of that was a radically converted Christian disciple. So before he was a great priest, before he was a great philosopher, before he was a great bishop, before he was a great pope, he was a radically converted Christian disciple who, by the time he was in his early manhood, had decided that that discipleship was going to be the centerpiece of his life. He often said in a variety of ways, Jesus Christ is the answer to the question that is every human life. Jesus Christ was certainly the answer to the question that was the life of Karol Joseph Wojtyła. And he spent the rest of his life, once he had been embraced by that love of Christ, in introducing it to others. So first he decides, I should do this as a priest, and then things unfold from there. But at the bottom of everything is this discipleship. And that, I think, gave his human personality a remarkable set of qualities. He was a man of genuine mystical experience, about which I really can't talk very much because he couldn't talk very much. I mean, this all took place in a different realm of human experience. And yet at the same time, he was an active man. He was an athlete till his body betrayed him. You don't usually get mystics and great skiers going together here. At least that's not what I intuit when I watch the Winter Olympics. He was a celibate who had a remarkable insight into the meaning of our embodiedness as male and female and the complementarity built into that. He was a philosopher who had a very rigorous mind, and he was a poet. He was a pastor who had first intended to live his Christian life as a layman. I said at the beginning of Witness to Hope that all lives run on rails. The question is, how broad is the gauge of the rails on which our lives are running? His life ran along a particularly broad-gauged railbed. And I think all of that finally comes back, the breadth of that gauge comes back finally to this radical discipleship. And that's important to stress, I think, because that's the connection between him and us. As we approach his beatification on May 1st, the question is going to be, is this someone who's so remarkably special that what the grace of God did in him, I'm just not material enough for that? And the answer to that is no. Because while none of us, I suspect, are going to have this enormous range of human talents and gifts that were bestowed upon him, we all have the possibility of being those radically converted disciples. And that's the connection. And that's why the Church is lifting him up on May 1st as an exemplary life for the rest of us to follow.
Very quickly. Very quickly.
It is, but I also want to stress that this was very thorough. I was actually a formal witness for the beatification process. I know something about the process. The postulator, the priest who was in charge of this, has become a good friend. There was nothing slipshod about this. Pope Benedict said, I want this to happen the right way. Everything is going to be looked at. The documentation fills 4 enormous volumes. Perhaps the most impressive part of that, though, is the letters. I was in the office of the postulation once in Rome a couple of years ago, and the postulator, Monsignor Oder, said, I want to show you something on the way out. And we went to their little mail rooms, no bigger than this space we're in here. And on the table were letters in a variety of languages that all said the same thing. Pope John Paul II, heaven. And there's a stamp on them. And they all got to this office somehow. And I said to the postulator, wait a minute, let me get this straight. The guys who cannot get my electric bill from one side of the county to the other can get this here. And he said, it's a miracle. I said, you have no idea how much a miracle it is. The most impressive thing about that, though, was not that these letters somehow found their way to the right place. It's that how many of them were from people who were not Christians, who were not religious believers of any sort, but who somehow felt that encountering this life had ennobled their own life. And I think that's that discipleship at work again.
Well, a good friend of mine, a very informed Jewish person who is an observant Jew, says, now don't forget, he's our Pope too.
Yes, right.
It's a fascinating observation.
Yeah, Cardinal O'Connor, who was a great friend of yours and of mine, said to me in the mid-1990s, the world knows it has a Pope. Yeah. And he talked of walking the streets of New York and having people come up to him whom he'd never seen before, who may not have been Catholic, in fact, probably most of them weren't, saying, Cardinal, how's the Pope? Yeah. It meant something. It meant something to them. I think part of this was that this man embodied the human drama of the second half of the 20th century in a singular way. He had been through the Second World War. He had lost childhood friends in the Holocaust of European Jewry. He had fought communism for 30 years. And he had come out of all of that a whole human being who could call people to a nobler conception of how they ought to lead their own lives. And I think at the end of what, in retrospect, was really a terrible century, the 20th century was a big mess. That at the end of that, there should be raised up this kind of a witness to what he called at the United Nations in 1995 a springtime of the human spirit was so refreshing, so distinctive, and so utterly unexpected. You didn't expect this in 1978. I didn't expect this in 1978. Nobody expected it in 1978. I think that explains something of the magnetism here. He showed us a better possibility when we thought that all of the good options had been foreclosed.
Later on, you know, when we look back, not us, but the generation or two after us, talk about the 20th century, some of the very worst people in human history were there.
Yep.
Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, they're particularly Hitler and his gang. Diabolical people. And yet, at the other end of that century, you have this great man and a number of other leaders.
Mother Teresa.
Mother Teresa.
Great friend of John Paul II. Yeah.
You have some great people. And I think of someone like Einstein, a great humanitarian. And some of the leaders in the Protestant world, Bonhoeffer, and people like that. They are the bright people at the end of that terrible century. But he brings it all together.
He brought it together in a distinctive way that I think points a direction for the church in the 21st century. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the great Russian writer and witness to human rights, in a lecture he gave in London in the early 1980s, went through all of this sorrow of the 20th century and said this has happened because men have forgotten God. That was the title of the lecture. And Karol Wojtyła certainly agreed with that. But what he added to the mix was that men had forgotten God because they had forgotten certain things about our own humanity. I mean, this was somebody who thought that the idea of the human person had somehow run off the rails over the previous several centuries, and he really believed that ideas have consequences, which means bad ideas have bad real-world consequences. All of those bad guys, let's not forget Lenin or Mao Zedong or any of this stuff, all of this comes out of bad ideas, particularly bad ideas of who human beings are. And that's why he, John Paul II, back as a kid bishop at the Second Vatican Council, wanted the focus of the council to be the restoration of the Christian idea of the human person. That's what he devoted his energies at the council to, and that's, in a sense, the leitmotif throughout the whole pontificate, recovering a truer, nobler, more demanding, to be sure, but more beautiful idea of who we are as human beings.
I have to speak in the world of psychology, going back 100 years ago, and you had a very mechanistic, so-called scientific approach to human beings, and you get an extremely pessimistic view with Sigmund Freud.
Right.
Very pessimistic. Personally, the man was not a bad man by any means and tried to do good, but it was completely off the rails. Gradually, in the course of time, more positive approaches came. And by this time, psychology has a soul. People will be denied that it has a soul, right, but it does, because the human race is not going to buy the picture of a human being as just an upstanding animal. He's not just a high-class gorilla. Yeah. But that's what was there, and that's what was faced at that point.
You may be aware, but I'm sure many people were not aware, that Wojtyła, from the time he was a young priest, was in serious conversation with the world of psychology and psychiatry.
Yes.
And he could do that as he did with other things that sometimes seem off-brand to religious people, because he had this remarkably serene conviction that all truths from wherever point you to the one truth, who is God the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. So if it's true, it's going to get you where you ought to be going eventually.
And he was not afraid of it.
Right, exactly.
And I want to have to give a little credit here to the Polish personality.
Absolutely.
I have no Polish relatives, but I grew up in Hudson County, and I grew up with lots of Polish people. And you know, there was something about the strength of these people who had stood alone between Europe and Asia, with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Russia, everybody running back and forth over this flat land, which is Poland means. And seldom did they have their own government. They, up until 1918, didn't have a government, a place. And he represents the very best of Poland. We're going to have a break now, so start getting your questions together, and you're going to be calling in a few minutes. So I want you to call me. Get me some questions. Having a lot of fun tonight with George Weigel, taking us on a great visit through Pope John Paul II. And our first call is from John. John, where are you from? What'd you like to tell us?
Well, Father, it's John from Ohio. I've spoken before, and your guest is wonderful. Huh? I wanted to say regarding John Paul II, you know, God can work slowly with people or very quickly. I had an overnight conversion, May 6, 1978. And then when he came in, I noticed how many people were reverting back to Catholicism that hadn't been there for a while. Now, I've read a little bit by him, and crossing the threshold of hope, I believe it's in there. He said, prayer is a conversation between the I and the thou, emphasis on the thou. And I think it's something we need. You know, the men got to stand up. You know, the women can't just be the spiritual ones. And what I wanted to say is, like our non-Catholic brothers and sisters would say, hey, I'm born again. Correct translation, born from above, a heavenly birth. Jesus Christ is number one. And the greatest commandment says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And in Matthew it says the second resembles it. It doesn't say equal it. Love your neighbor as yourself. I firmly believe if we can go straight up, you know, forget other people hurting us, God is there for each one of us individually. And I would like to hear your comments and the guest comments, and thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Thank you, John. Well, please, George.
Let me pick up on one thread of that and talk about the importance in the life of John Paul II of his father. His mother died when he was 8 years old. His father was, I think, the formative influence of his life. And one of the things his father taught him was that manliness and prayerfulness go together. There's nothing wimpish about being a radically converted Christian disciple. On the 50th anniversary of his ordination to the priesthood, John Paul II wrote a little book called Gift and Mystery. in which he talked about life with his father as his first seminary. Now, why is this all important? It's important because this man took that experience and, through the grace of God working in him, became a kind of universal father. When we think back to that remarkable reaction in April 2005 when he died, it was as if people had lost a beloved father, and not just Catholics.
No.
So I think there's another lesson here in the distinctiveness of a manly piety and spirituality, very important for the priesthood, very important for religious life, very important for family life, very important that fathers within their families feel this sense of conveying to their children that manliness, maturity, human greatness, if you will, and a deep piety go together. They're not antinomies.
I remember I was down and the Pope had come to the United States and in the South, and we were coming out, and one replaced me. You know, he's really a Baptist. Well, that was a great compliment from them. To the Baptist. That's what they didn't expect the Pope to sound like a Baptist.
Billy Graham, when John Paul II died, said this man was the great Christian witness of the second half of the 20th century. Wow. Now, since Billy Graham's the only other guy who's a plausible contender for the title, that's a pretty good statement. Yes. That's a very generous statement. And when I read that, I remembered that the last thing Karol Wojtyła did as Archbishop of Krakow, prior to leaving for Rome and the conclave that would elect him Pope, was to give permission for Billy Graham to preach in St. Anne's Collegiate Church at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow.
Is that so?
So there's a wonderful symmetry
Isn't
to
that
this.
Interesting.
Yeah, amazing.
Billy Graham preaching in Krakow.
Yeah, in Krakow, while they're electing the Archbishop of Krakow Pope.
Oh, my goodness, there's a piece of history that we haven't noticed.
There you go.
We have a call from Gene. Gene, where are you from, and what are you going to tell us?
Davis, Illinois. Father Groeschel, thoroughly enjoy your programs for many years, and my question is for Mr. Weigel. Read your Witness to Hope, enjoyed it very much, and I'm currently reading your present book, about a quarter of the way through, and it's just loaded with intrigue relative to the communist influence in many ways into Pope John Paul II, of course, but even obviously when he was in Poland. My question specifically, though, is the communist influence that you referenced to in Vatican II. Would you care to comment about that?
Well, this is an astonishing story. The communist secret police throughout Central and Eastern Europe, from the KGB to the Stasi to the Polish SB, they saw Vatican II as a fabulous environment for mischief-making. Plant assets inside the Vatican, make all sorts of trouble. The most remarkable story of this involves the great Catholic primate of Poland, Cardinal Stefan Wyszyński. The Polish secret police had hated and loathed Wyszyński for 20-plus years at this point. And they saw in the council's debates over the Virgin Mary and how she should be addressed in the council's documents a way to cut at Wyszyński's reputation. So working with, one has to say, regretfully, priests who were collaborators with the bad guys, they formulated a memorandum that was distributed to all of the bishops at the council, widely distributed in the world press, suggesting that Wyszyński's Marian piety, his devotion to Our Lady, was so over the top as to be virtually heretical. So here you've got a communist secret police agency attempting to manipulate an important theological conversation at an ecumenical council in order to do dirt to one of their enemies back home. When I said a moment ago it was all war all the time, that was no exaggeration.
Isn't that interesting? And that they made that attempt.
Well, and it worked for a while. I mean, this memorandum was regarded as authentic by a lot of foolish people, including a lot of foolish people in the world press. And while obviously Wyszynski recovered from this and whatnot, this is it's not the depth to which they would go. We know the depth to which they would go. But it's a very interesting facet of Vatican II history that I don't think anybody else has talked about the way I have in the end and the beginning.
And obviously, there are other examples of infiltration.
Unfortunately, yes. I mean, the period from the mid-'60s on was one in which the Soviet Secret Intelligence Service, the East Germans, the Poles, the Hungarians, it was a full-court press in Rome. Billions of dollars, billions of man-hours of effort. Some success at planting assets at kind of the Munchkin level. I mean, I don't think there was anybody being duplicitous at the level where things really happen. But some success at the Munchkin level, and not without some consequences, affecting negotiations between the Vatican and governments behind the Iron Curtain. The communist world regarded the Catholic Church as a mortal enemy. Mortal enemy. The United States was always referred to in KGB documents as the main adversary, capital M, capital A. But the Catholic Church was the principal ideological adversary in that part of Europe. So when you get a Pole, and a Pole known to be a tough-minded and shrewd advocate of human rights, who suddenly has the megaphone of the papacy, these guys hit the panic button, and from their point of view, logically.
We have a call now from Joe. Joe, where are you from, and what are you going to tell us?
I'm from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and I just wanted to hear your guest's comments on the relationship between Pope John Paul II and Cardinal Ratzinger, of course, who's now Pope Benedict, and the relationship between the two of them. I can't really think myself of one without thinking of the other, and how that the overall continuity involved in the outer workings of that, and maybe even some of the differences that they may have had between them, as exemplified by perhaps the conferences that Pope John Paul had at Assisi, that I'm under the impression that Cardinal Ratzinger at the time was rather reticent to endorse those, and yet they seem to have at the same time this great, almost symbiotic relationship between the two of them, so that it's hard for me to think of one without thinking the other.
I think that's a very insightful comment. I don't know of a relationship of this consequence for the life of the Church that is quite like this in certainly the modern history of the papacy. They worked in very close harness for more than 20 years, and they did it as very different types of guys. I mean, you had this great public personality, and you have this more shy and retiring scholar. You have a philosopher, and you have a theologian. You have a Pole, and you have a German. I mean, all of this should not have worked, and yet it worked fantastically well, which is to both of their credit. I think each saw in the other something that he didn't have. John Paul II clearly recognized in Ratzinger a more comprehensive theological intelligence than his own. Ratzinger saw in Wojtyła a personality of the type he could never be and didn't pretend to be, which is good because you can't fake this stuff. Real humility on both sides as well as genuine affection. It's worth thinking about how they were the same, though. These are two men who both were formed in this great Catholic renewal ferment in Central Europe in the mid-20th century. The movement to rediscover the Bible and the Fathers of the Church, the liturgical movement in its early classical period, Catholic social doctrine movement, etc., the renewal of theology and philosophy. There was this great ferment going on that eventually produced the Second Vatican Council, at which these two men played significant roles, and of whom they are the last two great witnesses. We have no idea who the next pope will be. One thing we know for absolutely certain is that he will not have been at the Second Vatican Council.
That's right.
In fact, were Pope Benedict XVI to be Leo XIII 2.0, which could happen, the next pope might not even have been born at the time of the Second Vatican Council. So I raise this because these two men, whom I think our caller is quite right, have to be seen in tandem, represent both the apogee, the high point, and the end of a period. We will, with the death of Pope Benedict, which, we hope is many, many years away, but with the end of that pontificate, we will have brought this period in the history of the Church to a close. So we're very, very fortunate that this, if you'll pardon the phrase, cashed out the way it did with these two personalities and their capacity to work together.
A name that I have to mention, though, and many of your audience may not be too familiar with him, is Leo XIII.
Absolutely.
Pope
right.
Leo XIII, at the beginning of the 20th century, opened up intellectually philosophy, theology, social responsibility, all kinds of things all over the place. And really, he was a bishop of a small diocese and up near Assisi, and he became, I think, Bishop of Perugia. And he, a town of St. Francis, and he started this gigantic renewal of the Catholic Church.
No, I think he's the beginning of the period of which these two men are the end. And no, he was a great, great man, and a lot of this begins there.
We have a call from Sonia. Sonia, you've been waiting for quite a while, so tell me, where are you from, and what's your question?
Yes, Father. Good evening, Father, and good evening, Mr. Weigel. And I'm calling from Astoria, Queens, New York. Pope John Paul the Great is indeed God's gift to us, to mankind in general. There's a belief that Pope John Paul II played a very important role in the formulation or the writing of the Prophetical Encyclical Humanae Vitae, which is, of course, the signature accomplishment of Pope Paul VI's papacy. Can you address the veracity of this claim, Mr. Weigel? And thank you, and God bless you.
Thank you for your call. I actually discussed this at great length in the first volume of this now two-volume biography, the first volume being Witness to Hope. Karol Wojtyła had a very close relationship with Paul VI. When Paul VI was struggling to come to a decision and an expression of that decision, he consulted Wojtyła. Wojtyła gathered a group of theologians in Krakow and prepared a memorandum for Paul VI, which I think Witness to Hope is the first book to ever bring that memorandum into English. I quote it somewhat extensively in there. And in that memorandum, Wojtyła and his theological consultants said, the classic teaching of the Church is true, but we need a new presentation of it. 10 years later, he would begin to implement that new presentation of these old truths in that series of audience addresses that spread out over 5 years and that we now call the theology of the body. So I think that's how all of that worked out. The language of Humanae Vitae is not the language that Wojtyła would have recommended. He thought what the Pope taught was right, but he thought there was another way to present this that might have a better shot at getting heard. Now, whether anybody could hear any of this in 1968, given the prevailing crazinesses of that time, is an open question. Nonetheless, John Paul II felt this was something that needed to continue to be addressed, and he addressed it in a way that I think has had a remarkable impact. When I go around college campuses now and find theology of the body discussion groups at Texas A&M University, I'm thinking something is moving here in a way that simply was not possible before.
Well, George, I want to thank you very much for coming down with us tonight, or coming up, I should say, from Washington. And our audience, I think, just in the quality of our discussion and our questions, I appreciate that. And I think it's an important part. So God bless you and your family.
Thank you.
And now we want to ask the Lord to bless each one of us. O Lord, be with us as Christians, as believers, all who believe in God, and especially help us who are Catholics to live up to our responsibilities and to be with the Church and all other believers, blessed by you, O Lord, that they will follow the way you call them. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. And now, of course, we always have our little appeal for help to keep EWTN going. And my good friend, Mother Angelica, is watching tonight, saying, now, she's praying. Can't talk to us, but she can pray. And so, think of that dear lady and keep our program going.